Another day, another baby blanket. I'm naming this design Milo, and with just an 8-row repeat, it is the perfect project for anybody who is an experienced knitter but doesn't want anything too complicated to tackle, or for the beginners amongst you who've mastered how to knit and how to purl and want to tackle your first big project, then this is perfect for you. To knit a blanket the same size as mine, which is 60 centimetres wide by about 80 centimetres long, you're going to need 400 grams of double knit yarn. I used King Cole Cherished in the shade Pearl, but any double knit 3-weight yarn, light worsted weight yarn, will work for this blanket. If you're looking for a meterage, you want between 900 and 1200 meters of yarn. You are also going to need some circular knitting needles. You want them to be 4 millimeters in diameter, and you want them to be at least 80 centimeters long so that you can accommodate all of the stitches that you need to cast on. Straight needles just won't be long enough because we have quite a lot of stitches in the width of this blanket, and straight needles just aren't going to be long enough to accommodate those stitches. You will also need some embroidery scissors so you can snip those ends of yarn nice and easily. Tapestry needles for sewing the yarn ends in, and then last but not least you want 2 stitch markers, and we use these to mark where our side border ends and our middle textured panel starts, and that just makes knitting the blanket so much easier because you don't have to count these initial stitches if you don't want to. Although my blanket is knitted all in one piece, when I give you the pattern multiple, I like to give the pattern multiple for that middle panel separately to the stitches for the border. That just gives you the flexibility to change the size of the border or change the type of border that you add on, either by adding on a border in a contrasting colour afterwards or by using something like seed stitch instead of garter stitch. So it gives you the ability to tailor what you want your blanket to be, but you can still know what your pattern multiple for that middle panel is. Now the middle panel for this pattern is a multiple of 10 plus 3. So that means that you cast on in multiples of 10, and then when you've done that you add 3 stitches. Then to finish off you are going to add another 18 stitches for your side borders. That is 9 either side. So if you want to replicate the blanket that I made, you want to cast on a total of 133 stitches, and that includes your 18 stitches for your borders. So that is your total amount that you need to cast on. I like to use the long tail cast on method. I do have a video that goes over it in nice beginner friendly steps that I will link for you, but if you have a cast on method that you prefer to use, then please go ahead and use it. It really doesn't matter. For this video, I'm just going to be knitting a really small sample, but you will need to cast on 133 stitches if you want to replicate my blanket. This blanket is worked from bottom to top, so the first part of our pattern that we need to tackle is that bottom garter stitch border. This is a total of 15 rows and they are worked all in the same way. So I will walk you through the first row and then I'll leave you to knit the 14 additional rows that make up our bottom garter stitch border. Now every final stitch of the row is our selvage, so that is worked in a slightly different way to the rest of the border. So to start with, you want to knit your way across, knitting every single stitch until you have just that final stitch of the row left to go. By working this final stitch slightly differently, it gives us a beautifully neat side edge that resembles something like a braid. So it's a technique that you will find me using a lot just because I really like the way that it looks. So instead of knitting this final stitch, we are going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. The way we do this is as follows. First things first, you want to get your working yarn to the front of your work. Now I just lift it and hold it while I work the stitch, but if you want to bring it all the way to the front of your work, if you feel more comfortable like that, that's fine too. So once you've popped your working yarn to the front of your work in the way that you prefer, you want to get this right hand needle and pop it into your stitch as if to purl. Now when we say as if to purl, we mean that we're going to go in from right to left and not from left to right as if we were going to knit the stitch. So pop that stitch firmly onto your right hand needle like that from right to left, and then once you're confident that it's on this right hand needle, you can take the left hand needle out, and then the last step is to just make sure that this working yarn is at the front of your work and not wrapped over your needle, because if you do this and turn your work, you can accidentally create a new stitch. So just make sure that it's at the front of your work. That's row 1 of 15. The next 14 rows are worked in exactly the same way, so I will leave you to carry on and work rows 2 to 15, and then at the end of row 15 I will show you how we start the middle textured panel that builds the bulk of our blanket. After your 15th row, your work should look a little bit like this. You should be able to count 8 garter ridges up your work, and you should, if you've used the long tail cast on, have this smooth side of the cast on facing you. This is what will end up being the right side of our work. I like to class this smooth side of the cast on as the right side. And the first time that we work row 1, we're going to do a little bit of setup work to get those stitch markers in place so that we can clearly see where our side borders start and end. The first time we work row 1, we're going to be placing the markers, but every subsequent time that we work row 1, you will slip the markers. So you want to start your row by knitting 9 stitches. Then when you've knit 9 stitches, you want to grab one of your 2 stitch markers and just pop it onto your right hand needle. Then you're going to carry on and knit until you have 9 stitches left to work in the row. So that will be when you have 9 stitches left on your left hand needle. Just like we did at the beginning of the row, when you have 9 stitches left to work, you're going to grab the second of your 2 stitch markers and pop it onto your right hand needle to mark out where that side border goes. Then you're going to carry on and knit the next 8 stitches, and that should leave you with just 1 stitch left to work. That's our selvage stitch, and just like we did for our garter stitch border, you are going to slip that stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 2, you want to knit until you hit your stitch marker, so that's a total of 9 stitches. Slip your stitch marker over from your left needle to your right needle, and then you are going to purl your way across all the way until you hit your second stitch marker. If you would like a beginner video that shows you the way I purl, that's not necessarily the right way to purl, it's just the way that works for me, then I'll link it at the top here so that you can take a look at it in nice, slow, beginner friendly steps. When you reach your second marker, you're going to slip it over to your right hand needle from your left hand needle, and then you want to carry on and knit 8 stitches, and that should leave you with just that one final stitch of the row to work. And as always, we are going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 3 is really nice and easy. You are going to knit every single stitch of the row with the exception of that final stitch. You're going to slip your stitch markers over as you hit them, and then when you do get to that final stitch of the row, don't forget that that's our selvage stitch, and you want to slip that purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 4 is one of the rows that adds texture to the front of our work, and you want to start row 4 by knitting until you hit that first stitch marker. Slip the marker over, and then you want to purl the next 3 stitches. Now we have a 10 stitch repeat that we are going to work all the way across until we hit our second stitch marker, and that goes as follows. You are going to knit 7 stitches, and then purl 3 stitches. And you want to repeat that block of 10 stitches, so knit 7, purl 3 all the way across until you hit your second marker. And if you've counted your stitches correctly, then you should be hitting that second marker after a purl 3. You can see I've reached my marker after a purl 3, and then you just want to slip that marker over from your right needle to your left needle, and then carry on and knit the next 8 stitches. Finish off your row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 5 is another nice and easy one. Just like all of our right side rows, you're going to knit all the way across, knitting every single stitch with the exception of that final stitch. You want to slip that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front to maintain that lovely neat selvage edge. And then also don't forget that you want to make sure that you slip your markers over from your left needle to your right needle, because if they drop off, it's going to be harder for you to know where your side borders are. Row 6 starts by knitting until you hit that first stitch marker. Slip the marker over from your left needle to your right needle, and then you want to purl all the stitches in between the two markers. So you are going to purl every stitch until you hit that second stitch marker. Slip that second marker over and then knit the next 8 stitches. That should leave you with just 1 stitch left to work. Don't forget that's our selvage stitch, so you want to pop your yarn to the front and then slip it purlwise. Row 7, just knit your way, knitting every stitch with the exception of that final stitch. You're going to slip your markers over from your left needle to your right needle as you come across them. And then that final stitch of the row, don't forget that instead of knitting that stitch, you want to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 8 is the final row in our repeat, and just like row 4, it's a row that builds texture on the front of the blanket. Like with all our right side rows, so our odd numbered rows, this row is really nice and simple. Just like row 7, you want to knit all the way across, knitting every single stitch with the exception of that final stitch. Don't forget that that final stitch is our selvage stitch, and you want to slip that purlwise with the yarn in front like I showed you when we were building up that bottom garter stitch border. But aside from that final stitch of the row, every stitch is a knit stitch. Once you've finished your 8-row repeat, you would then go back to row 1 and work those 8 rows again, and then do that process as many times as you need to until your blanket is about 6 centimeters shorter than you would like the finished item to be. In the case of my blanket, I repeated these 8 rows a total of 31 times, and a really good tip about counting your repeats is if you count this line of garter stitch on the front of your work, as that is the end of the repeat, by counting the number of times that you have that garter stitch row, you can easily count how many repeats you've worked. So I worked a total of 31, and then what I did after I worked my 31st repeat was, so that I have matching texture top and bottom, I repeated rows 1 to 7 once more. So I didn't work row 8. At that point, it's time to move on to the top garter stitch border. So I will go away now and repeat rows 1 to 7 just to give you an idea of what I mean, and then we can tackle the top garter stitch border together. You can see here that working that final set of rows 1 to 7 and leaving out row 8 gives us a lovely symmetrical top and bottom, and just makes it easier to calculate the top garter stitch edging, which is the section that we are going to move on to next. Just like with the bottom garter stitch border, the top garter stitch border consists of 15 rows worked in exactly the same way. When you work your first row, you can take out your stitch markers because we don't need those anymore. They were just in place to mark our side borders, and that doesn't matter once you move on to the top garter stitch edging. So just like with our bottom garter stitch border, you are going to knit all the way across and knit every single stitch with the exception of that final stitch of the row. We want to carry on this lovely neat selvage edge all the way to the end of our blanket. So for our top garter stitch border, we are going to carry on slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. So that's row 1 of 15 done. I will now leave you to go and carry on and work rows 2 to 15 in exactly the same way, and then once you've finished row 15, if you come back, I will show you how you cast off and get this blanket off your needles and into a finished item. After your 15th row, you should have a border that resembles the bottom border, so you should have 8 garter ridges, and you should have the right side of the work facing you as you're about to start your next row. The very last row of any knitting project is the cast off, and for my blankets I like to use a basic knitted cast off. I'm going to walk you through the first few stitches and then leave you to carry on, but if you need a more in-depth video, I do have one on the channel that I will link for you. That one goes through things in really slow, beginner-friendly steps, so if you are not familiar with this cast off, you might want to take a look at that first. The first step of your cast off is to knit 2 stitches. Don't knit them too tight, you want your tension to be quite nice and relaxed for this row so that your blanket lays flat once you cast off. Once you've knitted those 2 stitches, you're going to get this left hand needle and pop it into the stitch from left through to right. So not from right to left, but from left through to right. Then you're going to lift it up and over the second stitch that you knitted and all the way off your needles, making sure not to drop this other stitch off your needle as well by accident. So you can see here that we knitted 2 stitches and we have lifted the first stitch over the second, and we're now back down to 1 stitch on this right hand needle. So what you want to do next is to knit 1 more stitch, and then you're going to repeat the process. So you're going to lift the first stitch over the second stitch and all the way off your needle, while making sure not to drop that second stitch off your needles as well. So just once more, knit 1, lift the stitch by popping your needle in from left to right, lifting it all the way up and over the other stitch on your needle and then off. So you repeat this process of going up to 2 stitches, down to 1 stitch, up to 2 stitches, down to 1 stitch, and you will see that as you work your way across, you'll get a nice neat cast off top edge. So if you want to carry on and finish your row, and I will meet you when we just have 1 stitch left on this right hand needle like this and nothing on your left hand needle left to work. When you reach this point here that you just have this 1 final stitch left on your needle, you can break your yarn. You want to leave yourself a tail that is long enough to allow you enough to sew in your ends nice and neatly when you're done. And then just to secure this final stitch, I like to pull upwards to make it bigger. Can get rid of our needles, we don't need those anymore. And then I pop my finger and thumb through that stitch, grab the tail and pull it through. And then I just pull to tighten, and I find that that gives me a really nice solid foundation for sewing in my tail. Just before I go, I'm going to cover a couple of final bits and bobs. If I show you the back of this blanket, which a lot of people often like to see, you can see that it's not reversible, it's not ugly, it's not messy, it just doesn't look the same as the front. That's just the nature of stockinette stitch, it's not easy to avoid. For those of you that like to have written instructions to follow along to, I have a written pattern on my blog for free that I will pop a link to in the description. And then there's also an option to buy an ad-free PDF for those of you who would prefer to have something to print and take away with you rather than having to sit in front of a screen for the whole duration of your knitting. That's all from me. I will leave you with another one of my blankets, because if you've got the blanket addiction that I have, I know you'll be looking for something else to knit after you finish this one.